If you would open up your Old Testament to the book of Psalms, we will be reading Psalm 37. Thank you all for being here. We have several visitors with us and grateful for your presence, and hopefully that as we've studied and as we've worshiped and as we prayed and remembered the Lord's death, it will be a day of encouragement for you as you strive to please the Lord in all that you do. Today is also a special day for me. It is 29 years ago that Tracy said I do. And as my friend Don Willis would often say, for Tracy, it's been 19 very good years. It's been a really good 29 for me. From its opening lines, Psalm 37 resembles the didactic tone of the book of Proverbs. For example, Proverbs will say in chapter 23, verse 17, "Do not let your heart envy sinners, but always continue in the fear of the Lord." Similarly, Psalm 37 begins by saying, "Do not fret because of evildoers, and do not be envious toward wrongdoers." He'll encourage the listeners to trust in the Lord and do good so that you will live in the land and enjoy security. Verse 3, "And take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." And so often when we come to this psalm, it gives us an insight to really comprehending some important themes about living. And in fact, verse 4, not surprisingly, is usually invoked by those that we would call prosperity preachers. People that look at just say a prayer and God will give you a blessing. Made popular by one particular preacher by the name of Benny Hinn, who has in recent times discounted and admitted that what he had been saying about prosperity gospel was actually false. But his nephew, Costi Hinn, wrote a book called God, Greed, and the Prosperity Gospel. And in that book he said, "By an early age, as part of the Hinn family, I viewed Jesus Christ as our magic genie. Rub him right, and he'll give you whatever your heart desires." I quoted verses from the Bible like Psalm 37:4, which says, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart," and John 14:14, where Jesus says, "If you ask anything in my name, I will do it." The meaning of these scriptures were so obvious to me. Just ask Jesus Christ for anything, and when you say in Jesus' name, you'll have whatever it was you wanted. Seriously. That simple, not difficult to understand. God, greed, and the prosperity gospel. But as he'll outline in his story and how he abandoned that teaching, he realizes life is not as simple as saying certain words in order to receive material gain. When you read it alone, it might suggest that much, but that's the point that I want us to see. Is that if we read the psalm like a recipe, where we think each part can be consumed separately, then I'd encourage you to do the same thing the next time you make a cake and eat the first cup of flour by itself. The theme of the psalm is about inheriting the land. Notice in verse 9, he'll say, "For evildoers will be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord, they will inherit the land." Notice he says in verse 11, "The humble will inherit the land." Notice he'll also say in verse 22, "Those who are blessed by him will inherit the land." And then finally in verse 34, "Wait for the Lord, keep his way, and he will exalt you to inherit the land." David is writing this psalm, and it's a true psalm. But that expression, inherit the land, is going to give us insight into what it really means when bad guys win. Because that's what this psalm is about. David's writing as an old man. And through the nature of living and experiencing what life really brings, he writes this psalm as a didactic wisdom psalm to give us some insight into how life really needs to be lived. The psalm encourages us to have patience and trust God. And then he'll say that he will bring forth your righteousness as the light and your judgment like the noonday, verse 6. David had been there. Called to be the king, David was experiencing these realities even from being a teenager. Called as a king. But David did the right thing because when Saul would chase his life, he would spare Saul's life. He would watch Saul in the comfortable palace while David and his men are living their lives in caves. Even to Nabal, David and his friends did a small favor, but when seeking a response, in essence, Nabal says, you just go die. So David's call to be a king was not a call to perfect living. And for us, in reality, our life is not a call to perfect living. Let me ask you, what has God called you to? Are you married? Are you married to a sinner? Are you married to a person who thinks more of self more than they ever think of you? How about work? What have you been called to in your work, in your employment? Are you surrounded by people who don't really care about anything else but themselves? There's thorns and there's thistles and there's all sorts of uncomfort and discomfort. Are you a member of a church where there are sinners? People who create difficulty for you, people who disappoint you, people who don't even make you feel loved. What have you been called to? Sometimes it just seems like it doesn't even pay to try. Sometimes it doesn't even seem like it's worth doing any kind of good. But the psalmist will tell us that when it seems like the wicked win, stay put and do good. Read with me, Psalm 37. Do not fret because of evildoers. Do not be envious toward wrongdoers. For they will wither quickly like the grass and fade like the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and cultivate faithfulness. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust also in him, and he will do it. And he will bring forth your righteousness as the light, and your judgment as the noonday. Rest in the Lord, and wait patiently for him. Do not fret because of him who prospers in his way, because of the man who carries out wicked schemes. Cease from anger. Forsake wrath. Do not fret. It only leads to evil doing. For evildoers will be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord, they will inherit the land. Yet a little while, and the wicked man will be no more, and you will look carefully for his place, and he will not be there. But the humble will inherit the land, and will delight themselves in abundant prosperity. The wicked plots against the righteous and gnashes at him with his teeth. The Lord laughs at him, for he sees his day coming. The wicked have drawn the sword and bent their bow to cast down the afflicted and the needy, to slay those who are upright in conduct. Their sword will enter their own heart, and their bows will be broken. Better is the little of the righteous than the abundance of many wicked. For the arms of the wicked will be broken, but the Lord sustains the righteous. The Lord knows the day of the blameless, and their inheritance will be forever, and they will not be ashamed in the time of evil. And in the days of famine they will have abundance, but the wicked will perish. And the enemies of the Lord will be like the glory of the pastures. They vanish like smoke, they vanish away. The wicked borrows and does not pay back, but the righteous is gracious and gives. But those blessed by him will inherit the land, and those cursed by him will be cut off. The steps of a man are established by the Lord, and he delights in his way. When he falls, he shall not be hurled headlong, because the Lord is the one who holds his hand. I have been young, and now I am old. Yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken, or his descendants begging bread. All day long he is gracious and lends, and his descendants are a blessing. So depart from evil. Do good, so you will abide forever. For the Lord loves justice and does not forsake his godly ones. They are preserved forever, but the descendants of the wicked will be cut off. The righteous will inherit the land and dwell in it forever. The mouth of the righteous utters wisdom, and his tongue speaks justice. The law of his God is in his heart. His steps do not slip. The wicked spies upon the righteous and seeks to kill him. The Lord will not leave him in his hand, or let him be condemned when he is judged. Wait for the Lord and keep his way, and he will exalt you to inherit the land. When the wicked are cut off, you will see it. I have seen a violent, wicked man, spreading himself like a luxuriant tree in its native soil. Then he passed away, and lo, he was no more. I sought for him, but he could not be found. Mark the blameless man, and behold the upright, for the man of peace will have a posterity. But transgressors will be altogether destroyed. The posterity of the wicked will be cut off, but the salvation of the righteous is from the Lord. He is their strength in time of trouble, and the Lord helps them and delivers them. He delivers them from the wicked and saves them because they take refuge in him. This psalm is an acrostic in which approximately every other verse in your Bible begins with a successive letter of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew alphabet. And this is, we understand, intended by David to make this a psalm that could be memorable or memorizable, so that we could make these words part of something we can recite with clarity and recite with certainty and recite with calmness. And it's interesting to me that if the Hebrews made some of these psalms to be intentionally memorized, why is it so hard for us to make it memorized in us? When we find ourselves in places when it seems like the bad guys are winning, we aren't turning to the sources that will ultimately get us through it, but relying on the things that oftentimes create just more hardship. But when we break up the psalm, it's kind of broken in three different sections. Verses 1 through 11, and this is the first section. Verse 12 through verse 26 is the second. And verse 27 to the end of the chapter looks to me to be how we can look at the lesson today. So when you look at the first part of it, when bad guys win, submit to God. You know, that's what he says. Don't fret, he says. Notice he says in verse 6, he will bring forth your righteousness as the sun. And then he says in verse 7, rest in the Lord. Submitting to God means that we're going to put away the things that God has asked us to do. And what are the things that he asks us to put away? Irritation, envy, and anger. In fact, he says it pretty clearly in the first part of verse 1. Don't fret. Do not fret. He says it again in verse 7, don't fret. He says it again in verse 8, don't fret. Now, when I was a kid and I heard the word fret, that was only what girls did. But that's not what this word means. In Hebrew, the word means to burn. And so what David is saying is, don't work yourself up into a slow burn. Quit letting it get under your skin. One reason that I think we get in those places where we are allowing it to get us into this worked up burn is that what's happening around us with the bad guys winning is that we don't like the way God is running the world. And somehow we think that we could do a better job than the way God is letting all of this wickedness win. One aspect of really being submitted to God is to put off that irritation. He also tells us to not be envious of wrongdoers. And I think this again confronts the selfishness that sometimes we see really in our hearts. The evil motives that sometimes secretly make us realize who we really are. That is, secretly, we wish that we could do the same thing the evildoers do and still get on with God. Because that's why we would envy them. We want the pleasures of sin without the consequence of sin. If we submit to God, we're not going to be envying wrongdoers. And then he says, don't be angry. This word, much like the other word, angry, sounds, we know what that means, first of all. But it's interesting that the Hebrew word connects with the nostrils. So like when you were in kindergarten and you would draw a picture of the teacher being angry at the class, I'm sure you probably drew them with big blaring noses, nostrils sticking out, and lightning bolts coming out of their noses. This kind of hot wrath is what he's telling us to avoid. I apologized on the live stream to my father-in-law if he happens to be watching this. But there is not a better illustration than this. That when Tracy and I had come back for the holidays from Australia, Joshua was maybe 13, 14, 15 months. Had just started walking, or maybe he was a little older than that. I told it wrong in the first service, so there you go. But anyway, he was old enough to walk, and somehow Tracy and I had gone out the door, and I guess Joshua had seen us go out the door, and I think we had driven off and left. And Joshua figured out how to open the door and walked out of the door of Mom and Papa's house. The house was a soft, very quiet cul-de-sac. And he had walked out, and Papo, Tracy's dad, found him outside and brought him back in, and Josh was safe. But then we return to the story, and Joshua comes and tells us about the incident in the language that he is able to speak. And so we want to know what it was that happened. And Joshua said, Papo, me. Joshua knew exactly what was going on. Papa was angry with him because Papa was worried for his safety. Well, how does everyone else respond when we're just like that? In that case, Papa's very concerned for Joshua. But nearly always the reason we get like that is because someone has done us wrong. Don't fret. Don't envy wrongdoers. Don't be angry. I realize the Bible does say, be angry and yet do not sin. And usually the reason that we love that verse is we want to feel justified when we're angry. We want to feel sometimes with a self-righteousness that I have the right to be angry and put them down and tell them where they belong. But usually the rule of thumb for discerning between what is really anger like God has for when wrong is done and sinful anger is really, are you just really mad because someone crossed your path? Most anger ends up being selfish. Don't be angry. The second thing he says is put on trust, obedience, patience, and humility. And like a wise old man, not only does he tell us what we need to avoid, he kind of tells us what we need to be. And so when we see the bad guys winning, we need to shift our focus. And 4 times, David names God in this psalm. He wants them to call out to Yahweh, the covenant God, who is your God. Turn your attention to Him. Make your awareness of the reality that you exist in this world not for yourself. You don't exist in this world for your country. You exist in this world for your Creator. So what are we supposed to do? Put on trust, he says. Verse 3. Trust in the Lord, do good. Verse 5. Trust also in Him, and He will do it. Then he says in verse 3 again, trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and cultivate faithfulness. Not only should we put on trust, but we should put on obedience. Engage ourselves in the activity that manifests itself. Because this is the real truth, everyone. If someone were to put a blindfold across you and put you at the end of the Grand Canyon, and there's a big, long rope stringing across the canyon, and the other friend that you have with you, the only person there, is standing on the other side of the canyon, on the opposite side of the rope, and they say, trust me, I will get you across the canyon on that rope. The only way they're ever going to know that you really trust them is not when you take off the blindfold, but when you put your foot forward. How does God know that you trust Him? How do we know? It's when we put our foot forward. And if we'll put on trust and put on obedience, then we can put on patience. Notice he says in verse 11, the humble will inherit the land and will delight themselves in abundant prosperity. To be humble is to recognize, much like what Jesus says, blessed are the gentle, the humble, for they shall inherit the earth, Matthew chapter 5, verse 5. Those who spend their life asserting themselves and standing up for their own rights is the very opposite of living a life with sanity and living a life with peace that David says, now that I'm an old man, I'm starting to figure this all out. So when the bad guys win, stay put and do good. And finally, he'll say in verse 4, put on that delight. When we trust, when we obey, and we're patient and humble, the thing that you need in your life of joy, you'll find only in God. Because when the bad guys win, the best place to start is submitting to God. But then in verse 12, he goes on and talks about the other side of the picture. Because that's the truth about wisdom, is that wisdom finally helps us unveil the whole picture of life. And so not only should we submit ourselves to God by putting away these things, taking off these things, and putting on these things. But when the bad guys win, we have to learn to be content in the Lord. The psalm doesn't come from an ivory tower. David's life in many ways crumbled out of control. He saw his own son hanged from a tree. He saw his other son do awful things to his daughter. He had a wife who didn't really like him. And he lost the son of the wife that he seemed to love the most. So David, in his aged years, recognizes you've got to learn to be content where you are. And David said the reason is because the Lord is going to be the judge. Verse 12, the wicked plots against righteous. But verse 13, the Lord will laugh at him and see that his day is coming. If I'm going to deal with life, then I have to realize that God is going to be the one who's going to be that final judge. And I have to be content with that. Instead of always trying to take justice into our own hands, we have to realize that God is the one in control. There's a story told of a farmer who did not believe in God. He was an atheist. And when he would go to the regular farming meetings, the other farmers would talk about their faith in God, asking God to send the rain, because we all know that if you don't have rains, you won't have crops. And because he was an atheist, he resented that reality and how they devoted their life in prayer and they devoted their life going to church. So, as fall came upon the harvest time, he wrote to the local newspaper and he said, I plowed on Sunday, I planted on Sunday, I cultivated on Sunday, I hauled in my crops on Sunday. I never went to church on Sunday. But I hauled in more bushels per acre than any one of you people who believe in God and go to church. End quote. And then the editor printed the letter with a little editorial glib at the end. Well, the Lord doesn't always settle his accounts in October. And the Lord isn't going to settle his accounts on November 3rd, 2020. As Christians, we need to be assured that if the Lord doesn't settle all of his account, we need to realize that the judgment that will come, he will. And David, when he was old, realized he had to be content that the Lord would judge. Because David says the Lord will provide. Notice he says that. Better is the little of the righteous than the abundance of many wicked. The Lord will provide for what you need. So many times I know in my own life, I've never ever imagined the little that I really needed because I always imagined the more that I needed. But this isn't just about material either. That although David had lost a son and witnessed the awful atrocity to his daughter and then lost a baby, he still had life with his God. Verse 17, the Lord sustains the righteous. And if you keep reading, you'll notice that it is what David saw in those who were the righteous is that they continued to do things that manifested the glory of God. Verse 21, the righteous are gracious and give, that those who are blessed by him inherit the earth, because they are people who know who God is. The Lord who provides for them are people who turn around and make their life very much like God. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 8. Paul tells Timothy to teach people to share. If you're walking uprightly before God and living generously for others, you're understanding exactly what this is all about. God is not blind to people's evil. And God is not blind to your good. when the bad guys win. Be content. But then he goes on to say in verse 37, when the bad guys win, do right. Depart from evil and do good, so you will abide forever. We saw the theme in this psalm again and again, but here it becomes really prominent because when you're wronged, the temptation to retaliate is even stronger. And there are certain times in David's life when retaliation was something he engaged in. But there were times in his life when he resisted because righteousness ruled his heart. And exactly that is the point. Notice in verse 31. The law of his God is in his heart, and his steps do not slip. When the bad guys win, do right. We need to stop justifying and quitting this slap system of life. I slap you, you slap me, and back, and here we go again. It's what makes our world divided. It's what makes our world horrible to live in. It's what makes me want to turn the television off all the time. David is telling us that when bad guys win, we should submit to God, we should be content, but we should do right. Because when the bad guys win, we need to trust the Lord to judge righteously. If you've been wronged, get the long-range picture. God is the God of justice, he says in verse 28. He will right every wrong someday. And even when you get to the book of Revelation, you can see how God makes clear that he will bring an end to everything that is evil in his world. And that to the righteous he will deliver them from the wicked. God will act on behalf of his saints. And David said this before he ever read Revelation. The salvation of the righteous is from the Lord. He is their strength in time of trouble, and the Lord helps them and delivers them. He delivers them from the wicked and saves them because they take refuge in him. Because David knew, the great warrior king that he was, that he had expanded their borders. He had led Israel to reclaim land that had been lost in the previous regime of Saul, and even all of the land that was lost all during the period of Judges. But the great warrior king, he had expanded the borders. Israel's power and control in claiming the land that God had promised Abraham so long ago was something he was realizing within his own reign as a king. And here he sits, the old man. And he says the righteous will inherit the land. Because while David's feet stood on the land, what was in David's heart was the true land. To be in the presence with God for all of eternity. So you may say, well, Don, that's really pie in the sky thinking, Don. That's great for eternity, but I need to know about now. I need to deal with my life right now. I'm getting trampled by ruthless scoundrels. My family is falling apart. The world is falling apart. The world is on fire. And then Jesus in the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Gethsemane, bowed his head and prayed, let your will be done. And then was led by a ragamuffin bunch of men who didn't just rough him up. They beat him up. They slithered the skin of his back into ribbons of bloody flesh. A crown shoved deep into the brow of his head. While they spat upon him, laughed at him, mocked him. and suffered, and then was killed for the event that we have already celebrated today, the salvation of wicked men by the only good man who ever lived. Listen to what the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 12. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him, who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you may not grow weary and lose heart. You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood in your striving against sin, and you have forgotten the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you are reproved by him. For those whom the Lord loves, he disciplines, and he scourges every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you endure. God deals with you as with sons. But for what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are without discipline, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Furthermore, we had earthly fathers to discipline us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more rather be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. All discipline for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. Yet to those who have been trained by it, afterwards it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Therefore strengthen the hands that are weak and the knees that are feeble, and make straight paths for your feet, so that the limb which is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. Pursue peace with all men, and the sanctification without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up causing trouble, and by it many will be defiled. He'll say in verse 22, you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels, to the general assembly and the church of the firstborn, which are enrolled in heaven, and to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of righteous men made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood, which speaks better than the blood of Abel. See to it that you do not refuse him who speaks. Verse 28, therefore, since we receive a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us show gratitude by which we may offer to God an acceptable service with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. What we inherit in the land is what we put in your heart. The disciples saw in their Savior, and we must see in our Savior what he had in his. Because when David was finally old and could delight himself in the abundant peace, verse 11 of chapter 37, even when bad guys were winning, it was because he knew who was God.